Welcome to this presentation of Santa Barbara's earthquakes, droughts, floods, and shipwrecks through vintage postcards and photographs. My name is George Sampanis, and I will be your host as we open a window into Santa Barbara's past. As seen in parts 1 through 5, life here is not always perfect. Shipwrecks in the channel and the ever-presence of natural disasters such as droughts, floods, fires, and earthquakes, and the human response thereof, gives testimony to the spirit, strength, and resilience of its citizens in dealing with these calamities. Nowhere was this spirit more manifest than dealing with the devastating effects and the aftermath of the Santa Barbara earthquake of 1925. On Sunday night, June 28, 1925, most residents went to bed on an unusual, uncomfortably warm, humid, and still night. At 3:27 a.m., the pressure gauge at the Santa Barbara Water Department recorded slight tremors from a small earthquake, not enough to wake most citizens. At 6:42 a.m., as the sun rose on Monday morning, June 29, 1925, many were up and about getting ready to start the new week. 1 minute later, at 6:43 a.m., people were thrown out of their beds and tripped from their feet. The main shock of the earthquake had struck Santa Barbara. The epicenter was located in the Santa Barbara Channel, an extension of the Mesa Fault. There was a deep, deafening roar, like that from an approaching express train or from a prolonged thunderclap. For the next 19 seconds, the city shook to its core. Over the next 20 minutes, 4 strong aftershocks followed, each about 10 to 12 seconds long. Shocks of considerable intensity were felt at 5:40 p.m., another at 6:46 p.m., and 2 more at 7:22 and 7:23. The magnitude was estimated to be 6.4 on the Richter scale, 6.8 on the Mercalli Energy Release Scale, and a 9-category violent on the Mercalli Intensity Scale. It lasted about 19 seconds. The first shock, an upheaval, followed by a jerky swaying motion. The entire city shook with a ferocity that Ole Hansen, mayor of Seattle, who is here on business, described as sounding like a million dogs crunching bones. There is disagreement on the number of casualties, ranging from 12 to 14. In my research, I've documented 12. In addition, some 30 suffered serious injury, though none permanently disabled. Damage spread over 36 blocks, and according to the Board of Fire Underwriters of the Pacific, some 618 buildings were destroyed or damaged. Of that number, about 100 were destroyed or so badly damaged as to be condemned. In then-year dollars, damage was estimated at $15 million, with reconstruction costs estimated to be $20 million. Insurance covered about $5 million. This is a sky view of State Street damage, with the San Marcos building in the center, and the top of the Balboa building bottom center, which escaped with minor stress cracks. At about 6 a.m., some 43 minutes earlier, architect Julia Morgan arrived by train from San Francisco. She was scheduled to meet with Pearl Chase to review plans for the proposed Margaret Baylor Inn, a residence for young professional women. At 6:42, plans in hand, she walked a few steps to await a streetcar to carry her up State Street. Suddenly, she was knocked to the ground by the tumbler. Looking up the street, she saw white dust spurting from the fronts of buildings. On her hands and knees, she felt the streetcar tracks and worked her way through the blinding dust to the front of an auto sales room. She said, "If that auto showroom had a single structural joint left, I am surprised." She continues, "I went up State Street and saw the damage to the San Marcos building when a sudden jerk sent me off State Street to Chapala by way of the YMCA to the Carrillo Hotel. Then, in a roundabout way, to the Recreation Center. I found it safe, worked my way to State Street, got my bag from the sidewalk where I had left it, and my drawings unwrapped but safe." She found her drawing plans leaning against an automobile at the curb. Julia was the first woman to graduate from UC Berkeley's engineering program and from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and the first licensed female architect in California. 1 year later, she was the chief architect behind Hearst Castle. She is shown in these two photos discussing plans with William Randolph Hearst, who built the nation's largest newspaper chain, and the Hearst Castle. City manager Herbert Nunn related this account. "The day previously had been unusually warm for this district, and although I lived directly on the waterfront, on top of a bluff about 85 feet in height, I found it uncomfortably sultry at night. About 3:30 in the morning, I was awakened by a strong odor of crude oil. The odor was so strong and offensive that I was unable to sleep, and upon getting up to investigate, was surprised to note that there was no movement of the air whatsoever, and I returned to bed and to sleep. It is also interesting to note that crude oil came up from the beach sands within 200 yards of my home, and this phenomenon was repeated along the beach at several points south. About 1 mile south, there was a flow of several barrels of oil, which came directly through the beach sands. At the moment of the shock, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, facing northeast, and was thrown upon my back. Preceding the shock, there was a heavy rumbling sound similar to that of thunder, which apparently came from directly underneath. There was a barely perceptible interval between the rumbling sound and the shock. The first violent shock was followed instantaneously by a rapid vertical vibration, which I vividly remember. I immediately ran from my bedroom to the front lawn. As I stepped from the front porch to a slightly sloping grass plot, I was thrown violently. My wife and the gardener, who were on the opposite side of the house at the time, came through the house in stepping from a tiled porch to the grass. Both were thrown violently down. The roof was vibrating with sufficient force to break the tiles." End quote. State Street was left in a shamble of fallen brick and masonry. The 4-story San Marcos building was built on the former site of the Santa Barbara College at the corner of State and Anapamu Streets, as shown here. The earthquake completely destroyed the area between the red arrows that I have added. It was here that orthodontist Dr. James Cornelius Angle arrived early at his office, as he had planned to travel to Los Angeles that day. Also in the building was the maintenance engineer Sigmundo Mostiro, performing his duties, as was Macaria Villamar, the janitor, as the earthquake struck. The San Marcos building had been constructed with reinforced concrete. The doctor, the building engineer, and the janitor were buried under this mass of twisted steel and concrete. Rescuers began immediately to dig into the rubble in an attempt to save those trapped there. The first person to be rescued alive was Mrs. Macario Villamar, the janitor who was working on the 4th floor. She was found some 7 hours later under the debris with her leg locked under fallen timbers. Miraculously, only her leg was broken. Otherwise, she was uninjured. Sadly, Dr. Angel and Sigmundo Masterio both perished in the rubble. William Mathers was crushed by falling debris while sitting in his car parked beside the building. Quoting the UCSB project's website, although the San Marcos building was constructed of reinforced concrete, usually a construction method that stands up well to earthquakes, the L-shaped building was constructed in 2 sections, and they were not structurally tied together. Probably the different sections of the building battered against each other during the earthquake until parts of the sections collapsed. And as Walker Tompkins described it, the original structure and its annex smashed against each other like a sledge on an anvil. The State Street section was demolished after the earthquake, with the 3rd story removed from the Yanapamu section. It is pictured here today. Just a block and a half north of the San Marcos building stood the world-famous Arlington Hotel. As described in detail in an earlier presentation, the hotel's main building had burned to the ground in 1909. When rebuilt, a 50,000-gallon water tank was hidden in one of the hotel's towers. In an ironic twist, the tank, designated and designed to save the hotel from fire, was the cause of death to 2 well-known persons. Located in the tower below the water tank were the hotel's elegant tower suites, the finest accommodations the Arlington had to offer. In just a few seconds, the water tank began to oscillate, broke loose, and collapsed onto the 2 most luxurious suites. The occupant of the upper tower suite was Bertram Hancock, the only son and heir apparent to the vast Hancock fortune. In the suite below was the wealthy 82-year-old widow of the former railroad president Charles E. Perkins. Both perished in the catastrophe. The building was later demolished and replaced by the beautiful Fox Arlington Theater in 1931. Some 12 blocks south of the Arlington Hotel stood Santa Barbara's newly built Hotel California. Its grand opening occurred just 4 days earlier. Note the fire escape on the right side of the hotel. The fire escape collapsed onto the automobile shown here. Also, take a moment to notice the sheets hanging from the exposed rooms. Tenants used the sheets to lower themselves to safety, as all other means of escape were blocked for those on the upper floors. Here, it looks like a child's dollhouse with dressers, chairs, tables, and hot water radiators exposed in many of the rooms. Again, miraculously, no one was killed or injured. Not to make light of this tragic situation, but the twin beds are available for viewing as the sign above advertises, and these rooms truly had an unobstructed view of the ocean. The 4-story California hotel damage was caused, at least in part, because it was constructed on a somewhat shallow foundation and on what was formerly a tidewater marshland. Additionally, like the San Marcos, the brick sidewalls were not securely fastened to the rest of the structure. The nearby Neal Hotel was also built on shaky ground of filled-in land. It is being braced with huge beams a few days after the earthquake. Other hotels badly damaged by the quake included the El Camino Real Hotel, located on the 300 block of State Street. The Chevrolet dealership below the hotel was destroyed, as evidenced by the collapsed V-shaped floor damage. The Grand Hotel on the 400 block was the scene of the death of Ralph Litchfield, who was visiting Santa Barbara on business. He was found in front of the Brown Mug Cafe, buried in rubble from the hotel's fallen facade. Two unfortunate souls, Merced Leon and Mara Rentina Minitodo, lost their lives in the ruins of the Central Hotel, located on the 500 block of State Street, shown at left. The Barbara Hotel, upper right, and across the street is the Berg Hotel, bottom right. The four remaining casualties, from my count, were Demetrius Stavro and his restaurant on State Street. Fallen masonry killed Gerardo Chavez on Canon Perdido, John Shea Gardner at St. Anthony Seminary, and William Proctor at the Fugazi Bank. The whole back wall of the Hotel Virginia crumbled. The Virginia, the Berg, the Barbara, and the Neil had also been built on filled-in land, which added to their vulnerability. On the left, the Van Ness Hotel sustained significant damage, losing its roof and walls. On the right, the Carrillo Hotel. No serious injuries occurred at either location. The earthquake eliminated a total of 1,500 rooms in Santa Barbara. The historic Lower Clock Building at State and Ortega, also known as the Fithian Building, partially collapsed. Its cast iron trimmings, the clockworks, and ornate interior were crushed under tons of brick and mortar. Note the hands of the clock stopped at 6:42. The heroics of two utility employees saved the city from fire, which had destroyed San Francisco during the earthquake there in 1906. The Southern California Edison power plant sustained severe damage. William Engel, the night operator, dashed for the switch as the ground rolled and debris collapsed all around him. At Southern California Gas Company, Henry Ketz, the night engineer, also had the foresight to turn off the main emergency valve. And at the city waterworks, the main water valve was temporarily shut off to prevent flooding from many of the broken pipes. On West Cabrillo Boulevard, these streetcar tracks buckled and snapped. Nearby, at the Southern Pacific Railroad Roundhouse, now the location of Fess Parker's Doubletree, the foreman, W.H. Kirkbride, gave this account. A boilermaker was on the east end of the roundhouse, where the bricks were falling from the east wall. A portion of the roof over him crashed down and came to rest on a locomotive. He managed to crawl out unassisted and uninjured. A stationary engineer was struck on the head by a flying brick as the steam pipe broke off at the boiler. The roar of the escaping steam added to the tumult of falling walls and general confusion. Half dazed, he crawled back through the debris and extinguished the fire in the boiler. By 8 a.m., within less than 2 hours after the first tremor, the Red Cross set up headquarters at the City Plaza. 4 canteens were opened up. Through July 22nd, the Red Cross provided relief for over 520 families. Tents were set up at City Plaza, which became the command headquarters for municipal and supporting infrastructure. By 9 a.m., all city department heads had reported there for duty. A committee of public safety and reconstruction was immediately formed with the city manager Nunn as executive manager. First order of business was establishing a temporary police force comprised of police officers, deputy sheriffs, legionnaires, naval reservists, Spanish war veterans, and many other volunteers. Within hours, Santa Barbara had amassed a home guard force of close to 400 to patrol the streets and search for victims. With telegraph and phone wires down and electricity off, there was no communication with the outside world until an emergency radio was set up by two amateur radio operators in the middle of State Street. An SOS was broadcast and contact made with the ship in the channel, who then contacted the battleship Arkansas, which provided temporary support. The Arkansas arrived around 3 a.m. and sent 180 sailors ashore for patrol duty, and in addition, 24 medical men from the ship's hospital were taken to Cottage Hospital to assist there and to relieve the nurses that had been on duty since the quake struck. Once it was determined things were under control, the Arkansas recalled most of its sailors and left Santa Barbara around 9 a.m. Father Augustine Hobrecht recounts his experiences at the mission. At 6 a.m., he had gone to the choir loft where he joined two other friars. The choir had just left and gone down to the sanctuary. He said, "While I was standing close to the console of the organ, I felt a violent jolt which seemed to come from the very depths. The old mission began to sway with a crunching sound. Several large statues were catapulted from their pedestals. When, after a brief interval, the quake increased in violence, more things began to fall, and the noise became deafening. As some 15 people in the nave of the church began to rush for the door, I warned, 'Don't go out, the towers are crumbling.' The door of the choir loft was jammed, and after several forceful attempts, we were able to open it. The air was so thick with dust, we could only see a few feet ahead." He continues, "And as I took a few steps forward, I found myself plunging downward into what appeared to be a black hole. I landed below and began groping about. I found that Brother Firmus had fallen ahead of me. In a flash, I had the good old brother in my arms, half dragged and half carried to the outdoors. As we passed under the bell tower, half of which had already fallen, I could see one of the bells hanging from one of the beams that was still clinging to one side of the tower opening. And at that moment, the earth trembled again, enough to toll the bell as if in mourning." End quote. Once safely outside, Father Augustine observed 15 people standing about 100 yards away from the church walls. They had taken advantage of an interval between the second and third tremors to rush into the open. No deaths or serious injuries, but $500,000 in damage in then-year dollars. Practically all public buildings, schools, churches, library, courthouse, and jail were severely affected. The library was in ruins, and all the books were moved into a barn. The junior high school was totally destroyed, as were the Wilson, Lincoln, and the McKinley elementary schools. When news of the earthquake flashed across the country, F. Peabody, civic benefactor, was in New York ready to board a ship to Scandinavia. He canceled his trip and returned to Santa Barbara on the next train to throw himself into the work of rehabilitating the schools. The county jail was a total loss. 20 inmates were accounted for, and no injuries were reported. The county courthouse and the Hall of Records were also total losses. The Sheffield Reservoir Dam collapsed, sending 400,000 gallons of water down Sycamore Canyon and flooded the east side under 2 feet of water. A dairyman reached the Aliso Street Bridge when a torrent swept down upon him. He leaped from his auto and climbed a cliff to safety as the flood carried his car out to sea. Like a tsunami, the waters rushed down Alisos and Voluntario streets, carrying 3 houses, automobiles, and trees out to sea. It also flushed empty the bird refuge. Yet another miracle. No one was injured or drowned. And the dam has the unfortunate distinction of being the only dam in the United States history to fail. The Santa Barbara Daily News building had no visible damage, but, quoting Tom Stork, "I did not permit my staff to enter until an official inspection had been made and the structure pronounced safe and sound." End quote. With no gas or electricity available for the presses, Stork and his mechanical superintendent published the first issue on a single page using handset type and a hand-operated job press. Stork's editorial offered these encouraging words: "The people of Santa Barbara are meeting the burdens of this calamity which has fallen upon the city. The work of relief is already well organized. The hand of the builder will soon begin the task of rebuilding. There will be work for all, and all must work. In the end, Santa Barbara will come back bigger, better, and stronger than ever before. For the things that made our city and the men who built it are still here." End quote. The newspaper got out 3 extras that day, with some 10,000 copies in all. The news, although devastating, was also reassuring. The situation was under control. Policing was in place for safety, and it served to quell rumors and misinformation. By noon, the Southern Pacific Railroad had a relief train on the way from Los Angeles, carrying a 100-bed field hospital, 12 doctors, 22 nurses, and 3 family welfare workers. The doctors and nurses soon determined they were not needed, but there was need for the tents, cots, blankets, and lanterns which they had brought. For many days, hundreds of families continued to sleep in the open and cook their meals over campfires. Before the sun went down that fateful day, a committee of citizens was formed and given full power to meet emergencies and to plan for reconstruction. By the 1st of July, all its affairs were in order and ready to begin reconstruction. The roar of steam engines could be heard 24 hours a day, clearing away debris. Temporary booths were set up by merchants, with business as usual resuming rapidly. Southern California Edison broke all records for setting up a construction camp, did a month's work in 30 hours in restoring electrical current for the streetcars, and had street lights functioning in many areas before midnight. By Tuesday, the day after the quake, the Los Angeles Times, Herald, United Press, and other newspapers sent reporters and cameramen here to record the scene. News of the quake spread across the country. Shown here, the front page of the newspaper The Day, New London, Connecticut, June 30th, 1925. and this from the Fargo Forum, Fargo, North Dakota. Quoting Time Magazine, July 6, 1925 issue. Again, the continent shivered and stretched its right hip. Bricks fell in the streets of Santa Barbara. Buildings collapsed. Hotels and banks were reported in ruins. The dam of one of the city's reservoirs burst. Telegraphic and telephonic connections severed. Several were killed. The next group of slides show more damage and devastation as well as the humanitarian response thereto. will be listening to The Santa Barbara Earthquake, a song written 2 weeks after the disaster.
Way out in California, among the hills so tall, stands the town of Santa Barbara that they thought would never fall. And then one fatal morning, just before the break of day, when all the town lay sleeping, the hills began to sway. Then homes and buildings trembled and went crashing to the ground. The town was all in darkness and lights could not be found. There were wives and children screaming and dying everywhere, and the people all were praying, "Oh Lord, please hear our prayer." Then daylight found the people with sad and aching hearts. They were searching for their families that the earthquake tore apart. But some of them lay sleeping beneath the fallen stones, and their lips were closed forever, never more to cry and moan. It's just another warning from God up in the sky to tell all you good people that He still reigns on high. We cannot tell the moment when He will call us home, and we should all be ready before the time has
Stands out as the most
come.
prolific of all, having captured hundreds of professional images for posterity. Most residences escaped with little damage, although most lost their chimneys. A few of the damaged homes are pictured here and on the following few slides. Several of the larger estates, including the Billings, Knapp, and Peabody, suffered notable damage, as well as the Senator Greenwald residence shown here. Significant damage was done to the Dean House, located at Victoria and Santa Barbara Streets. Don't know the address of this damaged home, but I'll wager it was torn down. The aftershocks continued for months after the initial earthquake. Many Santa Barbara residents spent most of the summer camped out in their yards, others in the public parks and on the beach for fear of another big one. Santa Barbarans were relieved to hear that more than 300 Marines were being sent from San Diego to take over the task of patrolling and securing the city. The temporary volunteers had been at the job for over 48 hours. They were tired and overworked. Plus, they had a much bigger job ahead of them, the cleanup and rebuilding of the city. This is a nice aerial view of the Marine encampment surrounded by the track at Santa Barbara High School. The Marines, paid tribute to the Red Cross workers who, at all hours of the day and night, provided them with coffee and sandwiches. Not having enough to deal with patrolling and other duties, the Marines averted another catastrophe by rushing to the scene of a major brush fire on Mission Ridge. Gale winds were blowing, threatening to burn the entire city, but brave Marines fought the flames and extinguished the blaze. Quoting former Senator and Secretary of the Treasury William McAdoo, in a tribute to the Marines, said, quote, "The work that these men have been doing has been especially commendable, and the whole world has looked on in admiration of the manner in which they have handled the situation in the stricken city. The hardships that they have endured have been numerous, but their willingness and eagerness to be useful has carried them over the difficulties and inconveniences that they have encountered." End quote. While Santa Barbara's spirit was shaken, it could not be destroyed. The 1925 earthquake had culture-defining consequence for Santa Barbara, forcing it to remake downtown. Fortunately, Santa Barbara had in place community leaders and organizations with imagination and foresightedness. They had a vision for rebuilding the city. Out of the rubble, a new Santa Barbara would arise, as the headline proclaimed, "Spanish architecture to rise from ruins." They set upon rebuilding the city in the Spanish or mission architecture characterized by low buildings, arched entrances, decorative grilled balconies, and red tile roofs. Bernard Hoffman was considered to be the father of architectural planning in Santa Barbara. He had purchased the De La Guerra adobe in 1920, and together with the talents of architect James Osborne Craig, created the El Paseo, a quaint Spanish village of shops, offices, and restaurants. This project served as his model for the future of Santa Barbara. Just 6 weeks before the disaster, a new city building code was passed with Hoffman, the driving force. He was appointed chair of the Architectural Advisory Committee and also served as the chair of the Architectural Board of Review. This body passed judgment of approval or disapproval on the designs of new buildings. All rebuilding plans, ranging from laundry to factory, were submitted to the board. The rapid transformation of the city's downtown district is best described by Richard Requa, who wrote in the San Diego Union, "My first visit was immediately after the earth shocks had torn asunder and laid low so many of the structures. It is with shame now I confess that when I beheld the awful havoc and wholesale destruction, I was moved to feelings of commiseration. The virtual rebuilding of the entire business section, the rebuilding and repairs seemed an undertaking so gigantic, so beyond the financial means, physical resources, or mental determination of its people. How little did I realize the true character and spirit of her citizens. How an all but overwhelming catastrophe was to be regarded and seized upon as a propitious opportunity. Santa Barbara's rise from the ashes to the best organized, most public-spirited, and architecturally beautiful city in America really begs description." The earthquake had truly been a blessing in disguise. To the wonderment and delight with the progress, most of the rebuilding and repair had been completed within 3 months of the disaster. However, 1 year later, the mission still lay in ruins. Many meetings were held, but nothing was accomplished. Enter Dwight Murphy, citizen extraordinaire and knight on a golden horse. as we discussed in previous presentations. He was asked to chair a local committee to deal with the sad situation. Through his administrative and leadership skills and the faith, tact, and energy of the other committee members, mission accomplished. No pun intended. All creeds, social, civic, and commercial groups were brought together to support the restoration. Donations reached $400,000, allowing repairs and renovations so that today we can fully and proudly refer to her as the Queen of the Missions. As we lower the curtain on this presentation, enough cannot be said of the human response in dealing with this disaster. The planning, execution, spirit, strength, and resilience of Santa Barbara citizens was in no way more manifest than in dealing with the devastating effects and the aftermath of the Santa Barbara earthquake of 1925.